What? What is it?
All right. Now everybody put the, what do you got there? After we get this passed out, everybody put those darn cell phones down. We're going to focus on this for a little bit. Now here's what I'm thinking. Correct me if I'm mistaken. You could probably go collect paper with Darius if you wanted to talk on the cell phone, if you wanted to text. So put the cell phones down, please. Everybody put them away. Let's just focus on what we're talking about here. Because see, you're staying after school, and Malay, are you leaving now?
No, I'm not.
You're going to have embarrassed you into staying, haven't I? Yeah, because you wanted to go to the chemistry. Why is Latanzia doing this? Why is he having these chemistry review sessions on Tuesdays and Thursdays?
It's insane.
Why is that? Did you get this?
Yeah, I got it.
Okay. Now, if you look at the 10 documents to remember that I gave you here, so let's just take an overview look. Now, remember I asked you if everybody had this multiple choice test? Does everybody have this? Again, one more time. If you do that, I want you to look at the last question on that. I want you to look at the last question. It says 24 to 29. Refer to the excerpt below. 10 documents to remember. I want you to have those both in front of you. You have this, Alex? Here you go. Right? You have it? Right? Everybody got it? All right, good. Now, look at the 10. Now, this has no. These 10 documents have no legitimacy besides my own opinion. These are my opinion as to 10 documents. Now, I did look at a list of 100 documents that were selected as important documents in American history, documents to know, and I think 7 of these are on that list. I mean, obviously, the Declaration of Independence, the Federalist Paper number 10, Washington's Farewell Address, the Liberator is not on the list, nor is Andrew Jackson's bank veto. Abraham Lincoln's House Divided speech might be on the list. The Plessy versus Ferguson decision is on the list. The Truman Doctrine is on the list. The letter from the Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King, is not on the list. And I don't know if Ronald Reagan's inaugural is on the list. But I identify all 10 of these documents as important documents that hint at American identity. Now remember we said in the AP they have these themes. And one of those themes is American identity. What defines us as a people? Now, I think what defines us as a people doesn't always necessarily remain the same. But I think these documents bring up important elements of American identity at given times. Now, this is going to seem odd, but I want to look at the last one first. I want to look at Reagan's inaugural first. And the reason I want to do that is I want to go to the last question on the practice test, where it says 24 to 29. So read that along with me. It was in the suburbs, such as Garden Grove, Orange County, California, that small groups of middle-class men and women met in their new tract homes, seeking to turn the tide of liberal dominance, recruiting the like-minded. They organized study groups, opened Freedom Forum bookstores, filled the rolls of the John Birch Society, entered school board races, and worked within the Republican Party, all in an urgent struggle to safeguard their particular vision of freedom and the American heritage. In doing so, they became the ground forces of a conservative revival, one that transformed conservatism from a marginal force preoccupied with communism in the early 1960s into a viable electoral contender by the decade's end. Now, it's interesting that we talked about this today, But Ronald Reagan's election marks the end of the New Deal coalition. So I didn't do this in third period, but I did it in seventh and eighth. In seventh and eighth period, we said, okay, Franklin Roosevelt is triumphantly elected in 32, and then really triumphantly re-elected in 36. And by 36, he had built this remarkable political coalition that is called the New Deal Coalition, that is going to dominate politics until when? 1980. What happens in 1980? Ronald Reagan is elected to the presidency. Now, given what we said about the New Deal and the criticism of the New Deal, how does Ronald Reagan's inaugural address reflect? Hold on, we're going to read it. How does Ronald Reagan's inaugural address reflect a departure from the New Deal? So let's take a look at that. And it's number 10. So this is Ronald Reagan's first inaugural address. He is inaugurated in January of 1981. And he says this: in this present crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. From time to time, we have been tempted to believe that society has become too complex to be managed by self-rule. That government by an elite group is superior to government for, by, and of the people. But if no one among us is capable of governing himself, then no one among us has the capacity to govern someone else. Vasa, you're not actually a member of our class, but since you're conscious, and that's rare in econ, I will call upon you just to keep you engaged. Yes?
It's an adding to the New Deal because FDR's main goal for the whole entire New Deal was government programs and government getting involved in certain things. When Reagan, in the first sentence, whenever he says government becomes the solution, he's completely saying that government shouldn't be getting involved with certain things. There hasn't been realized.
Yeah, I think you said that nicely. Government is not the solution, right? Government's the problem. Now, if you think about it, in the New Deal, government was expected to be the solution. The New Deal is the child of the progressive era, and the progressive movement. The New Deal is an extension of progressivism. Progressivism is an extension of populism. So if we go back to the populists, what did the populists want? Yes?
They wanted basically everyone to have a job to be able to work.
No. More generally, what did the populists want? I mean, I think the populists, you say everybody would have a job. The populists wanted some level of security, but what did they want? Go ahead, Marissa. They wanted a relationship. What did the populists fear? Go ahead, Marissa. Well, of who? Not a big government, yes.
I was going to say big government.
No, I mean, they weren't happy with government, yes. Go ahead.
They wanted a direct correlation between the people and the government.
Yes. The populists believed that the government had come under control of the trusts and the big business interests and the railroads and the banks, etc. Right? And so they wanted government to work for them. Correct? Instead of for big business. Remember Mary Lease in the thing that we put up on the board, and she said this is a government of Wall Street, by Wall Street, and for Wall Street, right? So they want the power of government to be in the hands of the people, hence the populist movement. And they wanted government to actually work for the people, to tangibly, become involved in the economy, to make sure that, rail rates and interest rates and other things were fair for the people. So they are suggesting, the populists, a higher level of government involvement in the economic activity of the country than had been previously suggested. I mean, during the Gilded Age, government had worked under Republican leadership to support business. They had broken up strikes. Right? They broke up strikes. They used that. They promoted higher tariffs. It was considered to be laissez-faire capitalist, but I'm not sure that it was actually laissez-faire. And the populists are disagreeing. He says government's going to work for somebody. Is it going to work for big business or going to work for us? Well, the progressives come along, right? They follow the populists, and the progressives are saying, yes, if we want to prevent this whole thing from coming unraveled, government has to pursue some goals to kind of make sure that the radical elements in the right and the left don't undermine society. So government is going to have to kind of smooth out the rough edges of urbanization and industrialization, and provide some regulations and some laws and some protections for consumers and for workers and for others. But now the government is playing a bigger role on the local level and on the state level and on the national level. Then there is the backlash of the 1920s, right? So the 1920s comes along, and, you know, Harding and Coolidge and Hoover are saying, no, 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 let's back away and let business do their things, right? Yeah. So let's let business do their, let's let business do their things. Now the Great Depression comes along, and what does Franklin Roosevelt do? I mean, clearly the people are willing to let government take action. The first New Deal is 16 pieces of legislation that involve government. To do what? To provide recovery, relief, and reform of the system. And then, even with those 16 pieces of legislation, what is the people saying? The left is saying, we want more. Isn't that what we did today? We want more. We want government to intrude even further in the economy to redistribute income and wealth. And Roosevelt responds to that with the second New Deal. And that second New Deal, with sort of government involvement to support some level of income redistribution, to promote kind of some equity and equality in the system, is going to be what extends into what we'll call the Great Society of the 1960s. And Lyndon Johnson, who extends that even further with more government, and he calls it a war on poverty and more programs. By the late 1970s, people were increasingly fed up by it. Now you see that in that excerpt 24 and 25. And what's their big criticism of it? What runs through that excerpt as their criticism? Yes, go ahead, Nate.
Well,
government is threatening what? Government is threatening what?
Capitalism?
Well, capitalism, but they say it is more generally something that would be consistent. Look at what they're saying there. He said, a tide of liberal dominance, right? Recurring like-minded, they organized study groups and opened what? Freedom forums. So what is the government threatening? Freedom, liberty, right? Now that goes back to kind of the Declaration of Independence in that movement, but now the government, what does Reagan say? The government's not the solution any longer by the late 1970s, by the 1980s. The government isn't working. So the New Deal government is working for the common man. Roosevelt is going to talk all through the New Deal about the common man, the forgotten man. And now government is going to work for the forgotten man. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Did you have anything?
Yeah, but...
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to answer the question.
Go ahead. I want to hear it. Oh, I did it? Oh, good for me. Right? Good for me. Yeah, so the forgotten man. And so now government is working for the forgotten man. If Reagan became popular in 1980 with this ideology, what did many middle-class people apparently then believe? So Reagan becomes popular. He's elected easily in 1980. He says that in his inaugural address. What clearly, Mariana, did the people believe that voted for Reagan based on this government common man sort of thing? The government needed to be fixed and was no longer working for the common man, right? Who was the government working for? If it wasn't working for the common man, who was the government working for that Reagan is sort of backlashing against? Yes? Not big corporations. I don't think that was the problem. Yeah. Not necessarily themselves. Interests. The government is working for interests. The government is working for minority groups. The government is working for environmentalists. The government is working for various liberal interests and not working for the average person anymore. The deck is stacked against the average person, right? So Reagan reaches out and what they're called is, hang on one second, Reagan Democrats. Who were the Reagan Democrats? In the 1980s, the Reagan Democrats were the immigrants, the children of immigrants, the grandchildren of immigrants, the people who had been part of the New Deal coalition. Interestingly enough, Reagan is going to say that his political idol is FDR, right? So he says, I voted for it. Reagan is old when he's elected. This is in 1980. Reagan was 69 years old. So Reagan was, in the Great Depression. He says, I voted for Franklin Roosevelt. He's my idol. Wait a minute. You are against what Franklin Roosevelt seemed to stand for. How could Reagan reconcile his idling, Franklin Roosevelt with his position? Yes, go ahead. How could that be? How could that be? How could he reconcile those two together? Go ahead.
Well, in FDR, he was actually working for what we call the forgotten man. But not back then. That's when people were broke who didn't have jobs. In this case, it's the middle class people who actually have a job. They're trying to go further than that. Where these people, right now, the government's working for just certain groups. Certain groups,
and the government is holding them back. So the government is not the solution. The government is the problem. So it is a conservative backlash against sort of the culmination of the progressive era, the New Deal, and the Great Society. And Reagan taps that. Right? Now, let's look at the responses to that. Right? If we look, if you girls, if you have this practice test, right, take it out for the last question. That's what we're working on right now. It says, okay, we read that excerpt, and it's Lisa McGeer, Historian, Suburban Warriors, The Origins of the New American Right, 2001. Which of the following historical developments could best be used as evidence to support McGeer's argument in the excerpt? Right? So, based on that excerpt, what would be the best evidence to support it? New public defenses of the traditional family as an ideal, the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the emergence of the counterculture, and the rise of the Black Power movement. Now, based on those things, and I'm going to suspect that you have no idea what any of those are, right? But based on kind of the gist of that article, which is clearly the correct answer? Yes, A. Right? Now, let's read it again. Okay, now what was Reagan backlashing against? Reagan and the conservatives that emerged as a result of Reagan's candidacy or reflecting Reagan's candidacy are backlashing against interest groups that seemed that they were getting too much. Now one clearly was affirmative action, right? So what's affirmative action? Affirmative action is, all right, affirmative action says that, look, we want things like college admissions, jobs, other things to reflect the demographics of the population. So if we have 10% black people in the population, we want 10% of the black people to be in colleges too. We want the demographics reflected in the institutions. And we are going to take affirmative action, get it? Affirmative action to make that happen, right? So we're going to allow certain people, women, minorities, to get special privileges so that we can have college admission, jobs, other things reflect the demographics of the population. Okay? Now, So clearly that new right that emerges in 1980 doesn't like that, right? They don't like that. They don't like affirmative action. So look at B, C, and D. B talks about the passage of the Civil Rights Act of '64, right? Now, I mean, obviously that's giving civil rights to African Americans. Is that consistent with asserting kind of less government, more freedom? No. Right? The emergence of the counterculture were the hippies of the 1960s. Clearly that's not part of it. The rise of the Black Power movement is a version of the counterculture, a challenge to the status quo. Now, what do they want to do? Public defense of the traditional family is an idea. That's part of kind of the Reagan Revolution. What's wrong with the traditional family? Why do we have to have all these alternatives? Whatever. What's wrong with the way that we used to do it? Right, so A is the correct response. Let's see if we can get 25. Groups described in the excerpt, most likely opposed. So that new conservative group would be most likely opposed to, right? The Vietnam War, racial segregation, this is a little bit of a dicey one. Racial segregation, Great Society programs, organized public prayer. What would he be most likely opposed to? The group described, the Orange County group described there. Go ahead, Malay.
A?
No. C. The Great Society programs. That was Lyndon Johnson's Great Society programs. Right? 29. Which of the following historical developments most directly resulted from the trend? We're going to get this one. We're golden on this. We can't miss this one. Get ready. Which of the following historical developments most directly resulted from the trend described in the excerpt? The passage of a new immigration laws in 1965. Now look, if you think about the logic of that one, this is a trend in 2001, right? How could it possibly be something that happened in 1965? As Supreme Court decisions expanding individual freedoms in the 1960s and 70s, emergence of environmental activism in the 1970s, the election of Ronald Reagan as president in 1980. It seems like it would be D, right? Now, the advantage of this conversation that we're having here is we aren't going to get anywhere near this stuff by the time we take the AP test. We aren't going to say a word about Ronald Reagan in class. So what we are talking about now, getting a sense of Reagan, what Reagan was kind of generally about, his inaugural address, the emergence of what was called the New Right, the idea that they were rejecting kind of the culmination of populism, progressivism, the New Deal, and the Great Society, and the role of government in society and what government was trying to do in their vision is going to be a big part of what Reagan and the emergence of this new conservative movement that is symbolized by his election in 1980 is all about. And they're going to ask questions about Reagan and Reagan's, ideology of limited government, lower taxes, a more powerful military, defending the traditional values, patriotism, defending America. I mean, in the 60s, it was quite fashionable to kind of bash American institutions and values. That's the counterculture. They made reference to the counterculture there. Well, the counterculture is the hippies of the 1960s. Now the hippies are great for your kids as Halloween costumes. I know that, right? And and you dress up like a hippie, and if I said a hippie, you would have a familiarity with it. But the reason that hippies look so funny is because they were overtly rejecting all of the kind of values and cultural traditions that seemed to be part of the larger culture. So men had short hair, so they grew it long. People wore clothes that matched, so they wore clothes that didn't match. right? People were involved in traditional marriages, monogamous marriages, men and women together. So they lived with men and women outside of marriages. They had multiple partners. People, you know, in the larger society abused alcohol. They chose to abuse marijuana and other drugs. You know, they wanted to drop out with LSD and trips and things like that. They wanted music that didn't sound the same way. So all of those things that are kind of quaint about the hippies represent this larger rejection of the larger culture, right? Hence the counterculture. I mean, rock and roll was a huge response against the larger culture. Here is these sounds of these guitars, the gyrating people, the movements, the dancing, all of that was considered a challenge to the traditional culture, right? So a part of that was bashing America. America is inconsistent. America is bad. American values are shallow. Americans are doing this in Vietnam, you know, doing this with race and other things. Reagan is going to come along in 1980 and say, hey, look, we're not that bad. What we had in the past isn't that bad. America is great, and I'm going to make it great again. We're going to go back to those values and our traditions. We're going to celebrate Americanism instead of rejecting it. I mean, to some extent, in one way, Reagan is a challenge to the kind of progressivism, New Deal, Great Society, but he also represents a cultural challenge to the counterculture, right? And their challenges of the traditional values that they were criticizing by their actions in that time period. So, I mean, expect some things about that. So you kids are very fortunate that you are here and hearing that about number 10. Now that we did number 10, I'm wondering if we should work our way back from 10 rather than go to 1. Let's do that. Let's instead of going back to the Declaration of Independence, let's go back to number 9 and number 8. You know, those documents there. And let's go back to number 9, a letter from a Birmingham jail, Martin Luther King. You'll never guess where he wrote the letter from. The Birmingham jail, right? Now, Martin Luther King was in Birmingham in 1965, maybe. I'm not sure the date, I should know this. 1965, I want to say. He's in Birmingham, and he's leading a peaceful protest. So King is going to be the epicenter of the modern civil rights movement. And the modern civil rights movement is going to start with the Supreme Court decision, in my opinion, with the Supreme Court decision of Brown versus the Board of Education. Now, Brown versus the Board of Education is going to repeal the Plessy versus Ferguson decision, which is one of our things. Go to 7. In the Plessy versus Ferguson decision in 1896, listen to the quote I picked. Now, we talked about Plessy versus Ferguson, and I know some of you don't know what it says, which is extraordinarily disappointing, right? Because I know we talked, so when I say Plessy versus Ferguson, who will at least humor me by giving me the essence of that decision? Yes?
Jim Crow laws.
It's close. It constitutionalizes Jim Crow laws. But if we wanted to summarize Plessy versus Ferguson in a phrase, Malay, what would we say?
Separate but equal.
Separate but equal, right? So listen to this is from the decision itself, McKenna. We consider the underlying fallacy of the plaintiff's argument to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this be so, it is not by reason of anything found in this act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put that construction upon it. So, let's talk about that for a second. In the case of Plessy versus Ferguson, what was happening? Yes?
a man, Plessy, was it? Yeah. He was a mixed person.
1/8 black, correct?
Yes. And they wouldn't give him a certain seat just because of that 1/8 black.
So let's go back to Daniel Patrick Farragut, whose name is not really Daniel, right? But let's go back to him, but it should be. Let's go back to him. He said that this case is about Jim Crow laws, right? So Nate, the Jim Crow law was that Jim Crow laws were these laws that were passed in the South that formally and legally segregated the races. And they included public facilities, right? And they included public transportation. And the trains were public transportation, were they not? And so under the Jim Crow law in Louisiana, African Americans had to sit in a certain section of the train. Plessy, who was 1/8 black, chose to sit in the white section. He was told that he had to leave. He was refused and arrested as a result of the Jim Crow law. He appeals his arrest to the Supreme Court, and he says that this Jim Crow law is a violation of what part of the Constitution? Oh, very, very good, Andrew. The 14th Amendment. What does the 14th Amendment promise all people? 14th Amendment promised black people, white people, tall people, short people, what? When I do that, then somebody raise their hand and say, black people, tall people, short people, fat people, skinny people, gray-haired people, bald people, what?
All equal under the law.
Equal protection under the law, right? So, states had to offer equal protection under the law. Was a law that prohibited black people from traveling in certain cars on trains a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment? That's the question. If it was a violation of the 14th Amendment, then this law and all Jim Crow laws would be what? Unconstitutional, right? So now, all these states have Jim Crow laws in 1896. This case comes to court. Let's go back to the ruling. What does the ruling say? We consider the underlying fallacy of the plaintiff's argument to consist in the assumption that the enforced separation, what would the enforced separation be? The segregation, or the Jim Crow laws, right? The enforced segregation is the Jim Crow laws, right? Separation of the two races stamps the colored race with a badge of inferiority. If this be so, it's not by reason of anything found in the Act, but solely because the colored race chooses to put this construction on it. In other words, if you think that you are inferior because of this separation, it's because you think so, not because the law intends it to be so. So as long as there are separate facilities and they are equal, they are consistent with the 14th Amendment. Hence, this decision constitutionalizes, and you said that word a moment ago, say it again, segregation, right? It constitutionalizes segregation. Now, in 1954, put this under Martin Luther King if you're taking notes. In 1954, this decision was reversed by Brown versus the Board of Education. So, and you could put it under Plessy versus Ferguson too. It is reversed in 54 by Brown versus the Board of Education, which is going to say, now the Supreme Court is going to review segregated schools in Topeka, Kansas. And they are going to say that those schools that are separate are inherently unequal. So it is not a matter of black people considering themselves unequal as the reason for the inequality. In Brown versus the Board of Education, the court reverses Plessy and says that separate is inherently unequal. So now all the segregation laws of the South, all the segregated schools, all the Jim Crow laws are by implication unconstitutional because of Brown versus the Board of Education. But they have to, that desegregation has to be reversed. Martin Luther King is going to lead the charge in promoting that desegregation. And we know from listening to countless Martin Luther King Day speeches and other things that he's going to try to do this in a nonviolent, passive, resistant manner, right? Through peaceful protests. Now, he's doing a peaceful protest in Birmingham and he's in prison. Now, clearly, why was he in prison? Because he was violating a law. So if you read the letter from a Birmingham jail, it is addressed to my fellow clergymen, right? And in the letter, he's now Martin Luther King, the Reverend Martin Luther King, is a minister, right? And he had been criticized in Birmingham by clergymen in Birmingham for coming to Birmingham and violating the law, which is a violation of Christian tenets. In Christianity, there is this notion, and those of you that are Christian, I'm sure you know this, there's a notion in Christianity that Christians have an obligation to follow the laws that are issued by the state. Jesus says in Christianity, render unto Caesar what's Caesar's, right? You know, I mean, those of you that are Christians might know that. You know, render unto Caesar's what's Caesar's. The Apostle Paul is going to tell Christians, follow the laws of Rome. Couldn't get worse than Rome, right? So now how could King justify violating the law in conflict with kind of Christian teaching? Listen to the excerpt that I picked. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. So what's his argument? Go ahead, Vaso. I liked you in your conscience. Yes.
So basically he's saying that we should follow the laws given. But he said that the fact that he was in jail for what he did, he said that it's not an unjust. He said it was an unjust law, and that he said that if it is an unjust law,
then there's no Christian obligation to follow a law. Now this notion that people are not obliged to follow unjust laws, right? Where did we talk about that previously in our conversation? Go ahead, Marissa. Go ahead, Nate.
Reagan?
No, not our conversation today. In our conversation, yeah, go ahead. I never thought about it. That's a good point. I mean, the colonists are going to reject British law and seek independence. So that's a justification of it. But I was thinking about Thoreau and civil disobedience. How did Thoreau, and I'm sure you read about that in English, did you do civil disobedience? How did Thoreau justify not paying the poll tax? Because it was going to finance the Mexican War, which he thought perpetuated slavery, and so he justified civil disobedience in that manner. Isn't King taking a similar position here? If the law that is passed is unjust, then you don't have a moral obligation to follow it, right? So King is making an argument here that the religious criticism of his actions in desegregation and violation of Southern laws is not justified. And it's kind of like an important document in that modern civil rights period. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. Yes?
Isn't that also outlined in the Declaration of Independence?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you guys that say the Declaration of Independence is also a justification of that. So King's letter from a Birmingham jail is an important kind of justification of the modern civil rights movement. Now, let me point something out. We're going to do something on Thursday with the modern civil rights movement. We want to, on Thursday, go back with African Americans to the first slaves that arrive here, and we want to trace, you know, the kind of African American identity right up through the modern civil rights movement, right? I mean, so King represents the modern civil rights movement. And we're going to talk about that, hopefully we get to it, that not everyone is eventually going to agree with King's approach. right? I mean, clearly these clergymen didn't agree with his approach. Not everyone's going to agree with his approach, but we'll talk a little bit about that. Let's now go, so we did a letter from a Birmingham jail. Let's go to Truman and then we'll conclude, right? Now, all three of these are things from the modern era, right? Post-1945. Post-19, I mean, we are going to firmly get through the New Deal. We're going to go through World War II. We're going to end World War II. We're going to generally talk about the post-war era, and then we're going to have the test. I'm saying maybe 5 days talking about the post-war era, and then we're going to have the AP test. There is going to be a lot of stuff that happened that after World War II that we will not talk about before the AP test. Now, after the AP test, we're going to talk a lot about that stuff. That's not going to do us any good for the AP test, right? Now, one of the things that we are going to mention is the Truman Doctrine, and that is 1947. The Truman Doctrine connects back to the debate over the League of Nations and American isolationism in the aftermath of World War I. So it is the end of World War I, right? And the world is in rubble. I mean, France is decimated by World War I. England had lost a tremendous amount of life in World War I. England is broke. It can no longer kind of serve as the world's most powerful nation. Germany is decimated by the war. Russian territory is destroyed as the war. Europe is a mess. And the United States is this emerging industrial and military power. Woodrow Wilson wants the United States to take center stage, right? It wants the United States. Wilson leads the delegation to Versailles. He negotiates the Treaty of Paris, which includes the League of Nations. He wants the United States to embrace this treaty and the League of Nations, and he brings the treaty back to the United States. And we know this. When he does, there is this tremendous debate over the treaty that ends with it never being accepted by the United States Senate. The Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations is rejected. And when Harding is elected, Harding's election kind of represents a final rejection of the treaty and to some extent a retreat back into traditional American isolationism, right? And you can debate that a little bit, whether America was traditionally, is that a part of American identity or not? Isolationism. Now, that isolationism, we're going to talk about this tomorrow, that isolationism that the kind of America retreats into is going to be one of the things that allows Hitler to move in Europe, Mussolini to move in Europe, Stalin to move in Russia, the Japanese to move in Asia, because America isn't going to want to get involved. Now, eventually, obviously, we do get involved, right, in World War II. But now, this is 1947, and World War II ends in 1945. Now, after 1945, the big threat in our minds to the world is no longer Nazi Germany or Japanese militarism or Italian fascism. The big threat is communism that is centered in Stalinistic Russia, that is spreading, right? So Truman, in 1947, wants Congress to allocate aid to support the Greek government. Greece is being besieged by communist insurgents that are being financed and supported by the Soviet Union. Other countries in Europe, Poland, Bulgaria, have fallen to communist influence. Not Yugoslavia, well, independent communism in Yugoslavia, right? Have fallen to communist influence. Now Truman is asking Congress and the American people to send money to Greece. Listen to what he says. I believe it must be the policy of the United States to support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities and outside pressures. So the Greeks are resisting this, so we should help them. Not only should we help the Greeks, who else should we help? I believe it is the policy to support free peoples everywhere? Yes. Now, this becomes the question of the modern era in terms of U.S. foreign policy. Is it the business of the United States to support free people who are resisting armed subjugation, which is another word for, say it, what did I just say? Armed subjugation is analogous, given the context that I put it in, what, say it, McKenna? Communism. So should we support anybody who's fighting communism? Right, is the question in the Truman Doctrine. And Congress funds the Truman Doctrine, and the American people buy into opposing communist aggression everywhere. What does that lead to? Yes?
Container policy in Korea.
Korea, Vietnam, right? Other actions in other places. It leads to the Cuban Missile Crisis. It leads to, right? So the Truman Doctrine is the first formal manifestation, right, by an American president of the United States commitment. Now, I shouldn't say first, yeah, I'm comfortable with first formal manifestation. There might have been informal manifestations to that. But here Truman is saying, look, we've got to do this. This has got to be our policy. Now, eventually, in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, America is going to reject that policy. No, I don't want to do this anymore. Right? You know, we don't want to do this anymore. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, is that notion of the Truman Doctrine an extension of Winthrop's notion of a city on the hill? When I talk about Winthrop's notion of a city on the hill, what am I talking about? Go ahead, just another minute or two. Go ahead, Doug. Go ahead.
They're trying to be.
Who was that?
I'm guessing.
City on the Hill, Winthrop. Go ahead. Who are they? City on the Hill, John Winthrop. We've got to get this Malay said.
It's like colonists.
Puritans. Right? The Puritans. You said Puritans. Puritan City on the Hill. Right? Right? And so the City on the Hill was a shining example, a beacon to the world. Do we have an obligation to the world? Is that a sign of obligation? And is that why the world hates us? Right? You know, I mean, you know, that's an interesting question. All right. Well, I've clearly lost your attention, so we'll go with concluding there. Well, all right. That's it for today. Latanzi is killing me. Yes. So hang on to that. Have you ever tried that in the advanced placement United States history?
Yeah, earlier in the year, toward the end, I kind of...
Garrett, have you been putting these up on the site?
Yes, everyone is on.